Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Identity Politics, a Conspiracy Against Critical Theory. Dialectics seeks to say what something is, while identitarian thinking says what something comes under, what it exemplifies or represents, and what, accordingly, it is not itself. Adorno, Negative Dialectics. Hi everybody, and this is a topical image. For those of you who don't know, it's a Canadian MP, Member of Parliament. I think it's for the New Democratic Party, and I think she represents Manitoba, the great state of Manitoba. And I think it stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Two-Spirit, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer Questioning, Intersex and Asexual Plus. So it was at a press conference, I think, where this acronym, the ever-expanding alphabet usage, came out. And it was reported, as you can see, by CBC News, which I'm assuming is the Canadian equivalent to the BBC. I hope I've got that right. So I wanted to go on a slight diversion. I am going to finish more videos on Christopher Nolan and the Odyssey and how it relates to the original Odyssey. And there is a mention of that in this talk. But this specific talk, this incident made me think of the way in which quite often critical theory is bandied about as a cause of this type of identity politics. You might have heard the phrase cultural Marxism and critical theory often used together. And there are people like James Lindsay, there's an academic called Stephen Hicks who goes around propagating the idea that there's been this conspiratorial march into the major institutions of society by cultural Marxists and critical theorists. And this is what's led to this type of situation. So irrespective of your views, you could be sympathetic to this MP, you could be, your blood might boil because of the endless acronym politics. Irrespective of that, I want to do something slightly different today. I wanted to just address, and it might seem a relatively minor point, but to what extent can you genuinely blame critical theory for this type of politics? And I'm going to argue, using the work of critical theorists, that it's just a non sequitur. It makes no sense. It doesn't follow. And if that type of misrepresentation can happen, like I just repeat, you might think it's a relatively minor issue, but it just indicates the way in which people, Roland Barthes referred to ideology as what goes without saying, or modern myths as what goes without saying. We make these assumptions. And I think people lazily, because of the influence of people like Stephen Hicks and James Lindsay, they follow this and believe it, that somehow a lot of the world's ills can be laid at the door of abstract critical theory. So that's what I'm seeking to debunk. So these are, one of the main works I'm going to look at today is Dialectic of Enlightenment, which was written by these two guys. On the left, it's Max Horkheimer. And on the right, you have Theodor Adorno, who's possibly my favourite theorist, if that means anything. And they were members of a loose conglomeration of people called the Frankfurt School, which was the Institute for Social Research that was founded in 1923 at Goethe University in Germany. And some of its key members, there was Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Walter Benjamin, Wilhelm Reich, Jürgen Habermas, and I think it was Leo Löwenthal associated. He did work with them anyway. So a hodgepodge of German theorists that would now be called probably cultural Marxists. So I just want to explore what they actually said and how much they can be blamed for today's identity politics. So this is the main work I'm going to quote from. I am going to use another book called Negative Dialectics towards the end. If I used that at the beginning, you'd all just run away screaming, your ears bleeding with the because it is difficult stuff. But this is slightly more accessible. And I'm going to be drawing upon a particular chapter of this in future videos because it relates directly to the story of the Odyssey. So I will be exploring that in absolute detail because it really does feed into the videos I want to do on Christopher Nolan's IMAX film, The Odyssey. But for today, I wanted to look at the earlier part, and the vast majority of my quotations from this book are actually just from the preface, because you don't have to go much further to give quite a damning rejection of the idea that today's cultural politics, identity politics, is actually the fault of these type of guys. I just think it's a nonsense. So what are they referring to? I'll get into what a dialectic is as they refer to it. You've seen it in the epigraph straight away. They're opposing it, ironically, to identity thinking, which I'd argue is at the basis of identity politics, quite appropriately. But so I'll deal with the dialectic in a second. The Enlightenment it was also known as the Age of Reason, and it's normally used to describe 17th and 18th century Europe, the various intellectual movements of reason, individualism, and the growing importance of empirical evidence, so the scientific method, over previous traditions and the Christian faith, the importance of the church. So it suggests, and why it's interesting for the Christopher Nolan type Odyssey stuff, it actually traces the processes inherent in the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment way back, and they argue that Homer's Odyssey and Iliad show you the germs, the actual earlier part of the Enlightenment that has been part of Western culture since its very recorded beginnings, but more of that at a future date. So this is their definition of enlightenment. Enlightenment, understood in the wider sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Yet the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity, optimistic as ever. Enlightenment's program was the disenchantment of the world. It wanted to dispel myths, to overthrow fantasy with knowledge. So that's their summary of what the Enlightenment amounted to. The key phrases there are, where are we? Disenchantment, I'd pick out immediately. The idea that there were myths and religious beliefs, and the Enlightenment is all about advocating scientific objective knowledge rather than more enchanted forms of knowledge. And this goes to the concept of Homer and the Odyssey. In Odysseus in the Odyssey, uses his reason and his cunning to assert his own individuality. So they go on to argue that in an important sense, Odysseus is a key figure of the Enlightenment way back in ancient Greece. But this was the epigraph I used. I just wanted to return to it because I think it's important to emphasize what they mean. I've given you their summary of basically what enlightenment is. So what's dialectics? They say dialectics seeks to say what something is, while identitarian thinking says what something comes under, what it exemplifies or represents, and what accordingly it is not itself. So this is from Negative Dialectics, which, like I say, I'll look more towards the end for the hardcore people who stay with me right to the bitter end, and it will be bitter. But this concept of dialectics, a mode of thinking that the Frankfurt School, Adorno in particular, takes away from. He develops it from Hegel, but critiques Hegel in quite significant ways. More of that later. But identitarian thinking, let's just call it from now on, identity thinking is just easier to say. That, quite clearly to me, resonates or sums up identity politics today. The idea that whatever you feel yourself to be, there will be an appropriate label that you can subscribe to, and that defines you and your gender or your sexuality. This constant recourse to, as we saw the picture of the Canadian politician, a label can be found and you just keep adding to the acronym because there's this fetish almost for defining and labeling things. And what Adorno is saying is actually identitarian thinking says what something comes under, like these acronyms, what it exemplifies or represents, but that is not the same as the thing itself. And if Adorno's saying this, and Adorno was a key member of the critical theorists and the Frankfurt School, the idea that somehow the Frankfurt School is to blame for the worst aspects of identity politics strikes me as, not according to this at least, I don't think this is a stretch to say this directly opposes itself to identity thinking, what he calls identitarian thinking. So to develop this is from the Dialectic of Enlightenment. It's an early section called the Concept of Enlightenment. The rights of the shaman were directed at the wind, the rain, the snake outside, or the demon inside the sick person, not at materials or specimens like science would do. The spirit which practiced magic was not single or identical. It changed with the cult masks which represented the multiplicity of spirits. Magic is bloody untruth, but in it, domination is not yet disclaimed by transforming itself into a pure truth underlying the world which it enslaves. So what Adorno and Horkheimer are doing here is contrasting traditional concepts of the shaman and magic with the scientific, more objective measurement and domination and control of nature. So the idea it's domination is not yet disclaimed by transforming itself into a pure truth, the scientific truth underlying the world which it enslaves. Science is generally used to control, predict, and put the material world into a controllable sense of order. You can manipulate it. The magician imitates demons to frighten or placate them. He makes intimidating or appeasing gestures. Although his task was impersonation, he did not claim to be made in the image of the invisible power, as does civilized man, whose modest hunting ground then shrinks to the unified cosmos, in which nothing exists but prey. So it can be a really... Horkheimer and Adorno obviously wrote this together, but I smell the writing of Adorno here, because he has this beautiful way of making allusions and analogies. But this idea of the civilized man opposed to the magician imitating demons, and the idea native peoples would have that this idea of the happy hunting ground. So, sorry, the modest hunting ground. I think he might refer to the happy hunting ground later. But the hunting ground, there was a demarcated area of their environment in which indigenous peoples would go hunting, and they had a symbiotic relationship to the nature that surrounded them. He's contrasting that with the modern person, the civilized man, inverted commas, who turns the whole world, the unified cosmos, through science, and that means in which nothing exists but prey. In other words, everything is up for domination and control. And this is a Balinese mask, I think. So the way in which, demons are represented in indigenous early societies. I resisted the temptation to have a little insert of my face next to it, because, as we all know, it would not compare favourably. Although my hair's looking very similar at the moment, need to get a cut. Only when made in such an image does man attain the identity of the self, which cannot be lost in identification with the other, but takes possession of itself once and for all as an impenetrable mask, as you've just seen. It is the identity of mind and its correlative, the unity of nature, which subdues the abundance of qualities. Nature, stripped of qualities, becomes the chaotic stuff of mere classification, and the all-powerful self becomes a mere having, an abstract identity. So I'm arguing here that, as you can see from Adorno and Horkheimer, again, this is from the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the early part, the concept of enlightenment. I hope you can see how they're writing against the idea of today's identity politics is all about adopting a label and defining yourself, the very specific aspects of your gender or sexuality to the nth degree. So it's the identity of mind and its correlative, the unity of nature, which subdues the abundance of qualities. Nature stripped of qualities becomes the chaotic stuff of mere classification. I think that really accurately describes how the subtlety and the nuances of actual reality and nature get reduced down to the chaotic stuff of mere classification. Well, if that doesn't describe the Canadian MP's use of an endless abbreviation of all these letters to try and represent this chaotic stuff of mere classification, the all-powerful self becomes a mere having, an abstract identity. So I've always said, with regard to identity politics, I don't think it's a coincidence that this seeming need to assert one's identity, to label one's identity, to find this very specific definition, has coincided with a society dominated by social media and screen culture, in which identity for lots of people seems far away. They struggle to have a sense of identity. So they overcompensate by this constant emphasis, this constant obsession, to the point that the all-powerful self becomes a mere having, an abstract identity. So up until now, I hope I'm carrying you along, that you would agree with me. This hardly seems in keeping with the underlying ideology of identity politics. It seems to me it's the exact opposite. So this is the notion of adopting the abstract identity, or arguing that your true identity is whatever you decide to be, and there's constant emphasis on be who you are. This has taken this image, it's one of those, what do they call them, drag queen story hours, and this is from the I think this is American, the Association for Library Service to Children, which doesn't scan very well. You'd think a library service would be a bit more literate, but anyway, the Association for Library Service to Children, and their tagline is "Pursuing Excellence for Library Service to Children." One thing I'd always counsel people is that if you see the word excellence in any publicity documentation, you basically know the organisation is bogus. So, our prognosis regarding the associated lapse from Enlightenment into positivism, into the myth of that which is the case, and finally of the identity of intelligence and hostility to mind, has been overwhelmingly confirmed. Our concept of history does not believe itself elevated above history, but it does not merely chase after information in the positivist manner. So in the previous image, and I'm showing the mask, the idea that the all-powerful self becomes a mere having, an abstract identity. So this fixation about assuming an identity. And now I'm moving to this, the idea that this accounts for the paradox, where I'll develop this idea shortly, but we live in a society that's all about fact-checking, if not fact-shaming, or fat-shaming even. But I'll give you examples of BBC Verify. There's a whole movement in the European Union as well about arguing against disinformation and misinformation, and claiming that various organisations should be allowed to enforce their own protocols and criteria for what qualifies as misinformation or disinformation. There's a certain irony and humour to be found in the fact that on quite a few occasions the BBC fact-checking service has been found to have got things completely wrong, and by its own measurements put out disinformation, but there's a whole can of worms there. But this quote here, I'm pointing to it does not merely chase after information in the positivist manner. So Adorno and Horkheimer are arguing that critical theory that they're espousing isn't just about mere facts and the idea that there are pure facts. That is actually the position of things like BBC Verify or disinformation protocols in the EU, which I'll talk about more in a minute. It also refers to earlier the myth of that which is the case. So what they're emphasizing in both these things I've italicized is the notion that there is something graspable, there is something factual. And I've emphasized this particular quote because in the light of the previous social trend to be who you want to be and to take on an identity that you then treat as fact, this, I would suggest, accounts for what a lot of people find very confusing and sometimes annoying about the middle bit here, the identity of intelligence and hostility to mind. There seems to be an awful lot of intelligent people. I've seen lots of people giving evidence to Congress in the States or the British Parliament, and major figures in public institutions trip themselves up with word salads whilst trying to define what until the early 2000s and for thousands of years was known as the biological difference between the sexes. So that there is this hybrid of emphasis upon facts, institutions and government organisations being against disinformation and misinformation, while simultaneously an emphasis upon choosing the identity that you feel at home in. And that's something, again, I think you can unpick by using Adorno and Horkheimer and other critical theorists, despite the fact they're the ones supposedly at fault for all of this. But we'll develop this further. If public life has reached a state in which thought is being turned inescapably into a commodity, and language into celebration of the commodity, the attempt to trace the sources of this degradation must refuse obedience to the current linguistic and intellectual demands before it is rendered entirely futile by the consequence of those demands for world history. So this is one of the problems. In a way, I like this quote as a summary of the whole ethos of this channel, the idea that it's not commercially a viable channel, never going to make any money, because it's picking themes and topics that aren't monetizable in any significant way. And it's the commodified nature of knowledge. Into language becomes a celebration of the commodity. I'll give you a specific example of that in a second. This here is to illustrate the previous quote, and to bring this to make links with future videos about the Odyssey and Christopher Nolan. If you look at the tagline at the top, no creature on earth is weaker than man. So just to bring it back to, thought is being turned inescapably into a commodity, and language into celebration of the commodity. So that's the tagline used to. The Odyssey is being celebrated as a new IMAX film that's coming out. Yet, I don't think it's provocative or controversial to say there are very few people who will have read the Odyssey in its original form. Even before the Odyssey comes out, I don't think many people will be motivated enough to read the whole thing. So it's celebrated at the same time it's no longer read. And this tagline at the top, no creature on earth is weaker than man. This idea of language becoming a commodified form. I'm going to give you now a series of various translations of the actual phrase in Homer's Odyssey. So this is the Robert Fagles version. Of all that breathes and crawls across the earth, our Mother Earth breeds nothing feebler than a man. So you can see how the advertising people for Nolan have quite talk about using language to celebrate the commodity form. This is Emily Wilson's translation. Of all the creatures that live and breathe and creep on earth, we humans are weakest. And then finally, Daniel Mandelson's, for all of the things that breathe and creep about on the earth, there is nothing more feeble bred by the earth than a human being. So it's just a decaffeinated version, a simplified, dumbed-down version that you already get in the publicity when language becomes an element of commodity culture. Excuse me a second. In the belief that without strict limitation to the observation of facts and the calculation of probabilities, the cognitive mind would be over-receptive to charlatanism and superstition, that system is preparing arid ground for the greedy acceptance of charlatanism and superstition. Just as prohibition has always ensured the admission of the poisonous product, the blocking of the theoretical imagination has paved the way for political delusion. Even when people have not already succumbed to such delusion, they are deprived by the mechanisms of censorship, both the external ones and those implanted within them, of the means of resisting it. So this interests me because, where are we? They're pointing out the irony of Adorno and Horkheimer that the whole point of the Enlightenment is to free people, humankind, from reliance upon superstition, myth, and what they call charlatanism. But it reappears through the back door. So just as prohibition has always ensured the admission of the poisonous product, think of prohibition of alcohol in the States in the 30s, the blocking of the theoretical imagination has paved the way for political delusion. So they're saying that theoretical imagination, the imagination to be found in art and literature, because it's been pushed out more and more in society in the guise of making society more rational, it's actually paved the way for political delusion. And even when people haven't already succumbed to such delusion, they are deprived by the mechanisms of censorship. And it's interesting that in recent times in the UK, for example, could be careful what you say. You have the police knocking at the door. This used to be what we saw in Eastern Europe, and it's happening in the UK all the time. Both the external ones, so policemen knocking on the door, and those implanted within them of the means of resisting it. So there are external and internal modes of censorship. The external is the forces of the state. The internal ones are the way in which, in the education system, for example, you're inculcated with what's colloquially mostly referred to now as woke or incredibly progressive values that dominate institutions, to the extent that opposing points of view are deemed to be triggering or not acceptable, or in an ideology that promotes tolerance of everybody, ironically, only certain opinions are tolerated, and there's an intolerance for tolerating opinions you don't agree with in a seemingly superficially tolerant ideology, if that all makes sense. It's self-contradictory, but that's the point I'm trying to make. So this is the European Digital Rights Organization. I'm giving examples now of organizations that have identified this as a problem and are fighting back. But what I'm showing you is these are organizations that are fighting back, and their understanding of what's going on, their understanding of censorship, their understanding of being opposed by political organizations and structures that use DEI, diversity type ideology, inclusive inverted commas ideology, that actually tends to exclude a lot of people. But the type of rationale that would fuel resistance groups like this, I've just shown you, actually exist in this analysis by Adorno and Horkheimer. So again, just to make the point, if critical theory is responsible for identity politics, you could also argue quite clearly from this that it provides some theoretical, guidance for organisations like this that are fighting identity politics. And this is in the UK, the Free Speech Union, that is trying to oppose the actual occurrence of police officers knocking on your door because you've made hurty, and I could dig out loads of examples for you, but some of the reasons why police men and women are knocking on your door almost beggars belief, that the relatively innocuous nature, which in somewhere like America, the First Amendment would just, it couldn't happen. But increasingly here in the UK, it is. So on the right, for example, that's Alison Pearson. Toby Young is on the left, the bald guy holding the sign. He's the guy who founded the Free Speech Union. And the woman holding it on the right, behind, not in the denim or the blue, but behind with the blonde hair, she's Alison Pearson, who's a journalist for the Daily Telegraph, I think. And she was, as a journalist, an active working journalist, her door was knocked upon. I think she'd criticised, was it Essex Police or one of the police forces in the south of England, and she got a visit because she'd said something that was deemed inappropriate. So just to give, I'm not making these things up, these groups have had to, come about to try and offer some resistance. And again, this is from the European perspective. I took this from a CBS 60 Minutes documentary all about how in Germany they are policing so-called hate crimes, online comments that are deemed beyond the pale. In one case that I remember, the Chancellor, Chancellor Merz, he was called, I think it was a retired man called him Pinocchio, or referred to him using the phrase, that was it, Pinocchio is coming to Heilbronn, he said in an online comment. And he was being prosecuted under German online hate laws. And I think it all kicked off the US Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Sarah Rogers. I think she spoke out against it, and lo and behold, the Germans stopped the prosecution. But these are just examples of the type of thing. And I'm showing you these to show that in the previous quotes I was giving you from Adorno and Horkheimer, they're suggesting that this type of censorship, both internal and external, takes place. No terms are available which do not tend toward complicity with the prevailing intellectual trends. And what threadbare language cannot achieve on its own is precisely made good by the social machinery. The censors voluntarily maintained by the film factories to avoid greater costs have their counterparts in all of the departments. Now, I should say, from memory, this was written in 1944. So they're talking about the big film producers in Hollywood and so on having their own internal censors so that they could save money by not having to go to court with the government. And this is increasingly still happening today. So if you think of the sensitivity readers in publishing companies, if you think in education, there's a whole raft of administrators now basically policing the sensitivities of students. So it's good I got out when I did. I wouldn't have survived much longer. So the process to which a literary text is subjective, if not in the automatic foresight of its producer, then through the battery of readers, publishers, adapters and ghostwriters inside and outside the editorial office, outdoes any censor in its thoroughness. To render their function entirely superfluous appears to be the ambition of the educational system. So again, there are all these external censors that control what you say and increasingly try and influence how you think. But there's also the internal, and this is illustrated by the final phrase, to render their function, in other words, the external censors, entirely superfluous, appears to be the ambition of the educational system. And I can testify to that, the way in which the university system is inculcating students with, highly mono-progressive ideas that never seem to be adequately challenged by opposing points of view. And remember, if you believed certain people, the critical theorists were the ones responsible for this state of affairs. Yet, at least according to what they themselves wrote, I don't see how that follows. And this is just to, sorry, if I go backwards. To render their function entirely superfluous appears to be the ambition of the educational system. And then to show you, this was marketing, I think this is a Hong Kong organisation selling the British university experience to students in that part of the world. So I like this image because it's an image of that markets UK universities, and the method of its marketing of UK universities is to emphasise how certain UK universities are very good for the purposes of marketing and learning how to market. So it's marketing squared. So if you wanted evidence of how the British education system's been commodified, and this, I think, is the crux of it. If you want to know why uber progressive, tolerant, inverted commas, views that fail to tolerate any dissension or any opposing views, this is really the reason. It's the commodification, it's the marketing, it's the monoculture that you find in universities these days that doesn't allow for a genuine diversity of like an ecology of different ideas and ways of thinking. It's all monoculture. So the materially considerable and socially paltry rise in the standard of living of the lower classes is reflected in the hypocritical propagation of intellect. Intellect's true concern is a negation of reification. So what they're saying is what the intellect or universities should be after is trying to teach you how not to oversimplify, overly interpret things through a rigid pre-schema of understanding. You should genuinely try and understand. You should genuinely try and use your theoretical imagination. But that's the opposite of what goes on. It must perish when it is solidified into a cultural asset and handed out for consumption purposes. So what the image I just showed you of education being sold, marketed on the basis of its marketing potential for future marketing. The flood of precise information and brand new amusements make people smarter and more stupid at once. And I think I forgot to comment on an earlier phrase that was along the lines of the simultaneous existence of intelligence and the hatred of the mind or of education. It's this weird thing. A lot of bright people are spending all their time defeating the right of genuinely bright, well-educated people to think. And to give you a specific example, this, ironically, from the university I left, University of Leeds, this is a woman called Connie Shaw, who, if I can remember the whole story, she was basically working in the university student radio station, and she committed the absolutely horrendous crime of espousing or interviewing someone with gender critical views. And when I say gender critical, I think that's a euphemism for this student, who I think was a philosophy student. She believes in biological sex and she believes in women's rights. And for espousing or facilitating those views, she was told basically to leave the radio station, and had a all this was happening after I'd already left. It's one of my regrets I wasn't around to go and hold a few placards on her behalf. But what I'm now going to show you is she was interviewed by a student newspaper for, I think it's Exeter University. And that will just give you a flavour of how Stalinist, Pravda-like the university sector's become. This poor woman has now brilliantly made a career for herself in the UK media, and she's the press officer. I showed you the previous image of the Free Speech Union. She's the press officer for that organisation. So I'm really glad she came out the other side of the complete mess, or the... I'm trying to think of a polite phrase for how she was basically pursued and harassed for having views, essentially. There was an article, as you can see at the bottom. The article was called Honest or Harmful Freedom of Speech in University Journalism. Expose, I think it's the University of Exeter, that's why they're spelling it like that, speaks to Connie Shaw. So there was the whole article, and then this was the editorial note after it. So the editor's saying, LGBTQ plus society make a crucial point of whether expose they've obviously been contacted by the LGBTQ plus society. They make a crucial point of whether expose should publish opinions that differ from the university norm. So please think of that sentence in the light of the previous sentences from Horkheimer and Adorno, talking about the way in which the intellect is being attacked. The idea they're discussing is that whether a student university newspaper should publicise opinions that differ from the university norm, as if the university norm is this measurable thing that should be adhered to at all time, in the guise of still claiming to be a university devoted to the exploration of ideas and a whole range of human thought. It beggars belief. The objective of this article is to discuss freedom of speech using a contentious current debate, is there such a thing as biological sex, to highlight the controversial and perhaps differing opinions of university students compared to wider society. Expose prides itself in being a welcoming environment for people of all gender identities, well, not if you're Connie Shaw, and has chosen to publicise this discussion to bring trans people and gender non-conforming persons into the conversation where they have previously been excluded. We are not putting their rights up for debate, but are instead posing an alternative perspective from the media's reception of this story that has been saturated by major media outlets with little consultation of university students or the LGBTQ plus community. It's clear that not all beliefs are accepted in university spaces. The issue, though, is at what point freedom of speech creates an unwelcoming environment for trans or genderqueer students and fosters a culture that veers ever closer to hate speech. So this idea about a diversity of opinions not being allowed. There are still many questions to be answered about the place for freedom of speech in universities. That's an understatement. Expose will continue to interrogate the policies at the University of Exeter, in case any thought to get through the net, and in student societies to meet its commitment to the university community, to inform and engage with matters that are important to them. I'd question the use of the word inform there, given that the information seems to be unidirectional. And then I found this quite something that wouldn't be out of place in Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. To end the freedom to speak does not mean freedom from consequence. And this is also just an example of the state to which this policing of thought is taking place. So this is the national broadcaster. And BBC Verify was I think it was one of their earlier... It's one of their incarnations. They've had a couple now, I think, but this is one of their incarnations of the fact-checking that I mentioned earlier, has repeatedly got things wrong. But I remember growing up during the 70s and 80s. So the Cold War was still on. And you'd view askance and with horror the idea that in Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, you'd have state-sponsored, Pravda units that verified what was true and what wasn't. And here we have the BBC Verify. But I just also wanted to just that final sentence to end: the freedom to speak does not mean freedom from consequence. I'd love to know what the actual specific point being made. Because I've seen another footage of Connie Shaw having to be escorted with security to give a talk at another university. And a man in the audience basically stood up, and it wasn't a contribution to any meaningful debate. He basically questioned her right to be there because she was upsetting people, and was doing so in the guise of protecting various gendered groups, seemingly unaware of the irony that a large grown man was telling a young woman what she should say or do or be able to think. And again, having grown up, not exactly being famous for being an arch feminist, nevertheless, having grown up reading and seeing feminism trying to assert rights for women, to then see a situation in which men are telling women what to do in the guise of identity politics, it, to say the least, doesn't sit comfortably. It is in the nature of the calamitous situation existing today that even the most honourable reformer who recommends renewal in threadbare language reinforces the existing order he seeks to break by taking over its worn-out categorical apparatus and the pernicious power philosophy lying behind it. False clarity is only another name for myth. Myth was always obscure and luminous at once. It has always been distinguished by its familiarity and its exemption from the work of concepts. So just to unpack this, because it leads on to the concept of negative dialectics. So one of the problems is if you want to try and confront these type of anti-freedom of thought trends that are existing in society, the problem is even the most honourable reformer who recommends renewal in threadbare language, so the very language you're able to use. For example, if you speak out like Connie Shaw has much more successfully than I could do within the actual media system, you're still having to argue the threadbare language that the media allows. False clarity is only another name for myth. Myth was always obscure and luminous at once. It has always been distinguished by its familiarity and its exemption from the work of concepts. So this is one of the most interesting arguments in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, where it argues that rather than the Enlightenment getting rid of myth, taking it out of our society, it's a complicated book, but they argue in various ways myth has reappeared in our modern society. So increasingly we have myths about sex and gender that are being established with what they would call false clarity. And myth has always been distinguished by its familiarity. In other words, it seems very natural. So whilst some of the ideologies being espoused don't seem natural to lots of people, because of the constant use of falsely clear language, the ideological language that's being used to package ideas, this threadbare language, I can think of the constant repetition of certain cliches, for example, that assert certain scientific falsehoods, but because they're ideologically simpatico with various cultural trends, they become more and more familiar, and they're exempt from the work of concepts. It's very difficult to critically engage with ideas that you're not allowed to because of the increasingly draconian definition of what's allowed for you to say, as I gave evidence of, within Europe and the UK for sure. So this again is within Europe. This is the EU Digital Services Act of 2024. And this is the, flowchart, Venn diagram, hybrid, illegitimate offspring of the bureaucratic mind and how it deems discussion and choice of thought. And remember, I keep giving you quotes from critical theorists who described this in the 1940s, well ahead, 80 odd years ahead of their time, and it's getting worse, not better. But these are the same people accused by people like Stephen Hicks and James Lindsay of being behind these trends. So I'll just finish off with some quotes from Negative Dialectics, and I've deliberately left it to the end because it's difficult stuff. They basically, in this book, Adorno takes the idea of Hegel's dialectics and argues that it needs refining because it's too identity orientated, it's too reductionist. And Adorno argues for the preservation of genuinely critical thought, which again, in all the examples I've given, I think Adorno emphasised the importance of maintaining criticality of thought. So I think he would be absolutely appalled by some of the cultural trends that are currently happening. And I'll just give you one little example. It's difficult stuff. I don't mean to patronise anyone, but if you dip into it, you'll see what I mean. But he had this ongoing spat with Adorno. Sorry, Heidegger, Adorno did. And despite the fact they really didn't like each other, detested might not be too strong a word, there are some similarities which maybe one day I could explore. But this is just purely to give an example of how wonderful some of Adorno's catty language can be. He's having a go at Heidegger's theory, and he says, Heidegger wants to break out of the immanence of consciousness, but his outbreak is an outbreak into the mirror. He's talking about the enclosed self-circularity and false premises of Heidegger's philosophical starting point. And I just think it's a beautiful way of cattily saying he's going round in circles. His outbreak is an outbreak into the mirror. But sorry, I should have mentioned the notion of what is or what are negative dialectics. In Hegel, he had the concept of the dialectic, which is you have a thesis, an idea, you have the antithesis, the opposite to that idea, and in that interaction, the antithesis negates the thesis, and you get a third element, which is the synthesis. And there's lots of complicated technical terminology, and my German pronunciation's terrible, but Aufhebung is sublation in English, is one of the best ways to try and describe a very complicated idea. But a sublation is almost a negation of a negation. It's the idea that something preserves and simultaneously annuls. So you're taking something, you're adapting it, and it turns into something else. And Adorno accused Hegel of overly simplifying this idea that there is a world spirit of history, and things progressed through this spirit, and things were contained by the concept of identity. And without getting into all the philosophical complexities, I think what's most important about Adorno's take, his idea of negative dialectics, is, as I'll show you from some quotes to come up, there is always something left over when you try and describe the identity of something. What I like about Adorno is he doesn't try and subsume everything under this big Hegelian system where history progresses by this iron-like dialectic where everything gets sublated into the next progressive thing. Adorno's much more about the idea that there are just certain gaps, there are certain imponderables, there are certain things that are ineffable, they can't be put into words properly. So his notion of negative dialectics preserves something that I think psychologically much more accurate than these totalizing systems of people like Hegel. So he says such dialectics is negative. Its idea names the difference from Hegel. In Hegel, there was coincidence of identity and positivity, the inclusion of all non-identical and objective things in a subjectively expanded and exalted into an absolute spirit was to effect the reconcilement. On the other hand, the force of the entirety that works in every single definition is not simply its negation. That force itself is the negative, the untrue. So, how to begin to unpack this? But again, one of the reasons for showing you this is it might be really, philosophically nerdy and esoteric. But I'm just trying to show you what Adorno and other critical theorists were engaging with and how it just doesn't map onto easily the simplicity of identity politics. So in Hegel, there was a coincidence of identity and positivity. He's arguing in Hegel's system, he tries to find a way to include the inclusion of all non-identical and objective things in a subjectivity expanded and exalted into an absolute spirit. That's what I was saying earlier. The idea that history moves forward in this spirit in which the individuality of objects gets absorbed and progress occurs. But he says the force of the entirety that works in every single definition is not simply its negation. I mean, he's saying it's not just part of a dialectic. The force that tries to reduce everything to an identifiable definition, that force itself is the negative, the untrue. So it's Adorno saying it's not just that in Hegel's dialectic things evolve and they progress. By trying to define everything, by trying to include everything within a definition, you're using a method that is not a negation which involves some type of dialectical process. You're using something that is negative, it's untrue, because it doesn't tell the full truth of the thing that you're reducing by trying to fit it into an identity. And in the hugely complex philosophical way that I'm sorry to have to put it in these terms, but this is what lies behind today's identity politics. It's this Hegelian desire to reduce everything to an identity, and Adorno's arguing against it, not for it. The philosophy of the absolute and total subject is a particular one. The inherent reversibility of the identity thesis counteracts the principles of its spirit. If entity can be totally derived from that spirit, the spirit is doomed to resemble the mere entity it means to contradict. Otherwise, spirit and entity would not go together. So again, I'm just sorry for the complexity of it, but this is the interesting bit for me. It is precisely the insatiable identity principle that perpetuates antagonism by suppressing contradiction. That could be the motto for identity politics. What tolerates nothing that is not like itself thwarts the reconcilement for which it mistakes itself. So this is my point about tolerance. The tolerance of identity politics that actually becomes amazingly intolerant. The violence of equality mongering reproduces the contradiction it eliminates. So what tolerates nothing that is not like itself, thwarts the reconcilement for which it mistakes itself. It deems itself to be tolerant when in fact it's the exact opposite. And again, what a brilliant motto for today's identity politics. The violence of equality mongering reproduces the contradiction it eliminates. So in the guise of being tolerant, in the guise of allowing diversity, it doesn't allow contradiction. It doesn't allow opposing points of view. So then these are just, again, just the complexity with which Adorno approaches the topic. So this is a footnote. In the history of modern philosophy, the word identity has had several meanings. It designated the unity of personal consciousness, that an I remains the same in all its experiences. This meant the Kantian I think, which should be able to go with all my conceptions. So identity in philosophy has always been associated with this individual, the Cartesian subject, the Kantian subject, the person who thinks, the ideas. Then again, identity was what is legally the same in all rational beings, thought as logical universality. And besides, it was the equality with itself of every object of thought, the simple A equals A. So identity has a philosophical, logical meaning. So forget the idea of personal identity. Identity also meant this notion that something equals something else. Something can be identified as the same as something else. Finally, epistemologically, it meant that subject and object coincide, whatever their media. So the idea that subject and object, the thing and the thing being described, that the words or terms used to describe a thing are deemed to be the same. They coincide. So with the scientific method, material objects in the world are reduced to scientific definitions and or formula and can be manipulated and processed. Not even Kant keeps the first two layers of meaning strictly apart. And this is not due to a careless use of language. It's due to the fact that in idealism, identity designates the point of indifference of the psychological and logical moments. Logical universality, as the universality of thought, is tied to individual identity, without which it would not come into being. For nothing past would be maintained in something present, and thus nothing would be maintained as the same at all. So in idealist philosophy of people like Kant, identity designates the point of indifference of the psychological and logical moments. So the previous categories that would describe what does identity mean, the point being made here by Adorno is that in a certain philosophical mindset, the uniqueness, the particularity of an individual's psychological perception and logical moments, the idea that 2 and 2 equals 4 or A equals A, they just get conflated together. The recourse to this in turn presupposes logical universality. It is a recourse of thinking. The Kantian I think, the moment of individual unity, always requires the supra-individual generality as well. The individual I is one I solely by virtue of the generality of the principle of numerical unity. The unity of consciousness itself is a form of reflection of the logical identity. So it's paradoxical, but the university of consciousness itself is a form of reflection of logical identity. What Adorno's suggesting is our individual selves, the way we as people think, is inextricably linked to the more general process of logic, so that you really can't separate the identity of an individual thinker and the logic they're using. They both constitute each other in an ongoing process. So that an individual consciousness is one that applies only on the logical premise of the excluded middle, which is a philosophical term for, I think the definition is, it's a fundamental principle of, I'm reading here, of a classical logic, stating that for any proposition, either it is true or its negation is true. So something's either true or its opposite is true. So that it shall not be able to be something else. In that sense, its singularity, to be possible at all, must be supra-individual. Neither of the two moments has priority over the other. If there were no identical consciousness, no identity of particularization, there would be no universal, no more than there would be one the other way around. This is what lends epistemological legitimacy to the dialectical conception of particularity and universality, which again is a huge mouthful. But it just goes to this point that Adorno's making, that individual consciousness and the idea of the supra, above the individual, this realm of logic, neither of the two moments has priority over the other. You need the particular and you need the universal together. And that's what he emphasizes in his work, that there is this tension, whereas identity politics and modern science to some extent, they allow the universal to dominate the particular. So nowadays, the concept of self-identity has been, on the one hand, you have science, and it exaggerates the general power of logic and technological logic. And then you have individual identity, which overemphasizes the power of individual self-perception. And that has created identity politics. So there's been a separation, a schism, whereas Adorno's arguing here to avoid the excesses of science dominating the world for purely technological control reasons, and to avoid the excesses of identity politics and this idea that you can determine your own identity purely through self-perception and self-expression. He's arguing to respect the tension. So again, at quite a complex philosophical level, he's against identity politics. So then I'll just be starting to round up, but identity is the primal form of ideology. We relish it as adequacy to the thing it suppresses, and he can express himself quite elliptically, very subtle stuff. Adequacy has always been subjection to dominant purposes, and in that sense, its own contradiction. So identity is the primal form of ideology. When you see something as being adequate or meeting the necessary standards of something else, you're reducing it. And if you're using something for dominant purposes, you're contradicting the concept of adequacy. Because you're putting it to a use. It's not just the same. It's not just a passive form of identity or similarity or adequacy. You're using it to then manipulate or control. Ideology's power of resistance to enlightenment is owed to its complicity with identifying thought, or indeed with thought at large. The ideological side of thinking shows in its permanent failure to make good on the claim that the non-I is finally the I. The more the I thinks, the more perfectly will it find itself debased into an object. Identity becomes the authority for a doctrine of adjustment, and that's my phrase, transition, given the whole medical transition movement, in which the object, which the subject is supposed to go by, repays the subject for what the subject has done to it. So if I can just quickly unpack that. The ideological side of thinking shows in its permanent failure to make good on the claim that the non-I is finally the I. The more the I thinks, the more perfectly will it find itself debased into an object. So this idea that identity politics, it's supposed to be the assertion of your own personal identity, but actually you're objectifying yourself into a category. So identity becomes the authority for a doctrine of adjustment. So when people are transitioned in order to fulfill this objectified category, that this never-ending list of letters, LGBTQ, and on it goes, the identity becomes the authority for a doctrine of adjustment in which the object, which the subject is supposed to go by, the subjectified identity, repays the subject for what the subject has done to it. This reminds me of Jean Baudrillard's work, where he talks about, he did a book called Fatal Strategies in 1983, and the subtitle of that book is Revenge of the Crystal. And he has this whole esoteric idea of objects are basically getting their revenge on us because we overuse categories, we overuse schemas and objectification of the world around us, and it comes back and bites us in the backside. The name of dialectics says no more, to begin with, than that objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder, that they come to contradict the traditional norm of adequacy. I love this. Contradiction indicates the untruth of identity, the fact that the concept does not exhaust the thing conceived. So there's this constant cultural trend to define everything, to put it into categories. But Adorno's identifying this opposing force. Contradiction indicates the untruth of identity, why identity politics is ideological and lacking, the fact that the concept does not exhaust the thing conceived. Excuse me. Ideology lies in the substruction of something primary, the content of which hardly matters. It lies in the implicit identity of concept and thing, an identity justified by the world, even when a doctrine summarily teaches that consciousness depends on being. So a substruction is like an underlying foundational support. It's the structure of a concept, theory, or argument. I'm reading now. It's the process of building beneath, identifying the hidden, necessary, the understructure that must exist for a philosophical idea to hold up. So that's from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So notice the content of which hardly matters. It's when concepts are over-applied to things. So when identity politics over-applies identity categories to real people, they flatten out the nuance, they flatten out the individuality to the point that the content of which hardly matters. You become the category rather than a real person almost. So what is at issue here, to summarize, is not culture as a value, but the necessity for enlightenment to reflect on itself if humanity is not to be totally betrayed. What is at stake is not conservation of the past, but the fulfillment of past hopes. Today, however, the past is being continued as destruction of the past. If up to the 19th century respectable education was a privilege paid for by the increased sufferings of the uneducated, in the 20th, the hygienic factory is bought with the melting down of all cultural entities in the gigantic crucible. So I'll quickly just pick out the necessity for enlightenment to reflect on itself. Adorno saying that self-reflection, that self-criticality is increasingly leaving our society. The past is being continued as destruction of the past. That's what I'd argue is going on with the Odyssey, potentially. I honestly don't know how Nolan's going to pull off the adaptation in any way that's going to meaningfully be true to the original art form. He may make a stunning film, but I don't think it'll be particularly true to the Odyssey, which I'll be pursuing that argument in videos to come. This idea of the melting down of all cultural entities in the gigantic crucible, that's the message of defy the gods. So last couple of slides. The loyal son of modern civilization's fear of departing from the facts, which even in their perception are turned into cliches by the prevailing usages in science, business and politics, is exactly the same as the fear of social deviation. Those usages also define the concept of clarity in language and thought to which art, literature and philosophy must conform today. By tabooing any thought which sets out negatively from the facts and from the prevailing modes of thought as obscure, convoluted and preferably foreign, that concept holds minds captive in ever deeper blindness. So it's a panegyric basically to the importance of critical theory in its true sense, which again, just to sum up, is totally against identity politics and its limited mode of understanding the world. So the cliches of the prevailing usages in science, business and politics, you're not allowed to depart from the facts defined by various government organisations. By tabooing any thought which sets out negatively from the facts and from the prevailing modes of thought as obscure, convoluted and preferably foreign, that concept holds mind captive in ever deeper blindness. So to the extent we're not allowed to think for ourselves anymore, it leads to ever deeper blindness. And I thought I'd finish on this really appropriate image. I think this was the predecessor to BBC Verify that I showed you earlier. And what I love about this is from 2017. And what I particularly like about it is the fact they don't seem to have any concern about the Orwellian, or to mix literary references, the Eye of Sauron. Just the self-importance of the BBC, that they think they are the arbiters of truth. And they will prevent us from the blindness just referred to by Adorno. So on that suitably downbeat note, all the very best. Take care. Till the next time.